And I'm going to say, welcome everyone. This is Debbie Mayberry with National Kitchen and Bath Association. You're here for our final webinar of the year in the month of December. We want to thank Gebrit for their generous sponsorship for all of our webinars this month. You're here for the session called What's Driving the Home Improvement Market, How It's Changing and Key Strategies to Adapt. And Misha Fisher is with us. He's the chief economist with Angie Home Services, Home Advisor, and Angie's List. And Misha, we are ready to get started. Thank you so very much.
Perfect. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it. And I've enjoyed the chat box since, we're not a massive group of thousands. We're, I think, a smaller, intimate group. So feel free to chime in on the chat box. I've got it up on one monitor, and I always love to see what people are thinking and questions as they come up. And Debbie, is this correct? We'll do a little bit of Q&A at the end.
Yes, that is correct. Thanks.
Perfect. So we'll address those questions at the end. But I've enjoyed seeing where everybody's chiming in from. As I mentioned, I've spent winters in both Ottawa and Chicago, and Ottawa takes the cake as being more intense, as tough as some of the Chicago winters are. But great to be with you all. As Debbie mentioned, I'm the chief economist for Home Advisor and Angie's List. And what that means is I spend my time sort of thinking about what's going on in the broader housing market and how that's particularly impacting remodeling specifically, and then home services more generally. And what we'll do today is we'll cover sort of three different big pieces of what's going on. And the first thing we'll look at is demographics and housing and what the market looks like, because I think that's really important context. And we'll do that pre-COVID. Then we'll look at what COVID did particularly, and then we'll pivot to sort of what you can expect and the key strategies to adapt. And the way we'll specifically break out those sort of 1, 2, 3 pieces is we'll look at this primer on the home servicing market specifically. So what are the top lines? How do we tend to view it from an empirical standpoint? Then we'll look specifically at a takeaway, what happened to home services as a result of COVID. We've had COVID come in and impact every part of the economy. A lot of parts of the economy were hit hard and really suffered. Some parts actually, COVID was a good thing for them in terms of what happened to their businesses. Obviously, the human toll is separate and devastating, but in terms of understanding what's going on in the economy, that's an important piece. Then we'll look specifically at how consumers have shifted. What we can learn from the broader economy is also a key thing. I think there's a lot of tendency, if you're a professional going about your day-to-day, to sort of ignore what's going on in a lot of the economic indicators, and that's fair. It's hard to make that connection between the macro and then the micro of your business, but the macro is composed of the micro, and there is a connection there, so we'll explore that a little bit. And then finally, we'll cover some strategies to adapt as we enter 2021. That's what we'll cover today. A few quick words about myself, chief economist at Home Advisor and Angie's List. So I focus specifically on consumer behavior, labor market dynamics, housing market trends, and then the scale and scope of the overall market. I also moonlight as an instructor at Northwestern University, so I still make it to Chicago pretty frequently to teach there. I teach an applied statistics and quantitative analysis class. And before that, I was the chief economist and advisor to the Illinois governor on economic issues and a deputy director of the Illinois Department of Commerce. And before that, I spent just shy of a decade in Washington, D.C., working on policy for infrastructure and science for the United States Congress. So that's a little bit about myself, and look forward to the conversation at the end. Let's jump right into it. Let's look at the market. So what was the market like pre-COVID? Pre-COVID, the way we tend to view the home service market is there's about $506 billion in annual spending in the US. That's about 511 million completed service requests. These are our estimates. And obviously that covers a broad range of subjects. So a completed service request could be somebody showing up and cleaning a house. It could be somebody doing a complete demo and remodel. So there's a wide range there in terms of what those things are. But if you add all those together, we estimate that about 511 million take place in a year. If you have an average price of about $1,000, then you end up with 506 billion in spending. Obviously, some things are much cheaper. If you're talking about a house cleaning for between $50 and $100, or you're talking about a kitchen remodel for $40,000 or $50,000. So there's a wide range here, but those are the big averages. And that's split across the about 124, 125 million existing homes that are occupied. In total, there's about 140 million housing units in the US. That's everything from standalone single-family houses to high-rise apartments. So that runs the gamut. But all of them have some degree of home service needs. And that work is being done by, we estimate, about 5 million people who are actively doing this work in a given year. And obviously there's some flux there too. People hop in and out. Sometimes people are working on residential work. Sometimes they go over into commercial work. We're just looking at what we estimate the residential to be. Continuing on this theme, we can look at the top line. So as I covered, the occupied housing units and total housing units, about 120, 125 million occupied, about 140 million total. But a big change, and this is where we're going to start to think about what's going to happen in the coming year. A big change over the past year has been what happened to the home ownership rate. Coming in about a year ago, it was about 64.8%. Now it's about 67.4%. That's actually a big, big shift for this series. The home ownership rate does not change that dramatically. It's remarkably stable over time, but we saw a great big increase in the home ownership rate this year. And why does this matter? Well, if you look at the orange line on this graph, that's total housing. And if you look at the blue line, that's occupied housing. And they're indexed to 100, which is when the Great Recession hit. So if you look at the far right-hand side of the graph, you can see that occupied housing has dramatically overgrown total housing. And the reason for this is because we've been underbuilding housing for the last 10 years. And so this is sort of the second hint at what we've been seeing coming down the pipeline. So the first was that we've seen a big dramatic increase in the home ownership rate. And the second, we've seen that the growth in occupied housing has exceeded the growth in total housing, which means that the supply is getting shorter. There's less supply available because we're shrinking that gap between the two. And that's been pronounced over the last 10 years. So take those 2 points and file them away in the back of your mind for a moment, and we'll continue on to some other things, and you'll see how all these things fit together. The next thing we want to look at is, how does spending change by structure type? And this is an important point, because if you look on the third bar to the right, apartments and high rises, they spend about 30% of what people in a single family house spend in any given year. So if you look at the far left-hand side, single family house, that's indexed to 100%. So the average of what they spend can shift around, and it's a little over 10,000 bucks in the past year in terms of what people are spending. But if you think, okay, well, how close are apartment high-rise spenders to that, and how close are townhouse, duplex, triplex, quadplex, or fourplex to the spending? And you can see townhouses, it comes down a little bit. They spend about 10% less than a single-family house on average, but they're pretty close. But they're both dramatically higher than apartments and high-rises. So this is the third thing I want you to file away, which is people in apartments and high-rises spend significantly less than people in single-family houses. So if people were to shift from single-family houses to apartments, high-rises, on average, we would expect spending to sort of drop pretty dramatically. But if they go the other way, we would expect it to rise pretty dramatically. So take that point and file it away. These are all just sort of standards for the market independent of COVID. The next thing we want to think about are age and demographics. So this is an approximate population distribution for the United States. And you can see there are a couple of big humps in here. The first in red highlighted on the right is baby boomers. The second are millennials and the Gen Z cohort sort of coming down the pipeline. And you can see boomers are about to sort of hit where the silent are right now. And there's going to be a lot of demand need for two different reasons. The first is, if boomers decide to stay in their homes, that stage of life is going to change pretty dramatically what they want their home to do in terms of accessibility, efficiency, being something that is a nice place to live for somebody in their 70s and 80s, which is very different than a nice place to live for somebody in their 30s or 40s. Personally speaking, my wife and I are in a narrow, tall townhouse. But my grandfather, who's 98, jokes that he could never live in it because there's too many stairs. And that's the sort of thing that writ large is a big deal, because all of this housing stock that is currently owned by boomers has to be updated if they want to stay in place. And if they don't want to stay in place, the design trends are not going to be what a millennial or a Gen Z is interested in. So stay in place, it needs to change. If they move, they start that vacancy chain where they're selling their house and putting it on the market. Now all of a sudden there's a lot of work to update it and bring it up to speed for a new buyer. So again, demographics can also really shape how the housing market behaves. So take those four things that I just highlighted, tuck them away in terms of thinking through demographics, type of structure, we've underbuilt our supply, and then let's think about what happened as a result of COVID. So COVID-19 hit this year. First time we've had a pandemic on this scale in 100 years. First time it's happened in sort of the modern economy. And it's hit every sector of the economy, as I mentioned. And obviously, the human toll has been devastating. But let's think about specifically just the economic piece right now. The important sort of thing to know when you're looking at what happened to COVID is that typically service type activity is different than production activity. So what we've got here are single family house sales in orange, production of single family houses. And in blue, we've got per capita service spending. And that big drop off is what happened during the last recession. And so the production of something dropped dramatically as a result of the recession, but you can see service spending didn't really change very much. And that's the typical story for recessions, is that services don't drop or get as dramatically impacted as production type activity. And COVID's been a little bit different in that sense, because obviously it's an infectious disease. So the impact suddenly hits services pretty dramatically. And you would think that might suddenly open up home services to that exposure. You would think, okay, well, if services are being hit, maybe that hits home services as well. But that's not necessarily what happened. And I think everybody who's working in the industry kind of already realizes this, depending on where you are. Some industries, some parts, depending on what you're doing in home services, have been hit more than others. But I suspect a higher proportion of people on here have not seen their businesses hit in the way that people in the restaurant industry or travel or hotel or other services, even things like barbershops and estheticians and lots of other typical face-to-face services. So let's look at what specifically people were experiencing, because everybody has their own anecdotal story. We looked at what pros were experiencing at the onset of COVID-19. We asked people sort of at the peak of the shutdowns, right after the NBA season had been canceled, right when things were at their sort of peak in terms of not understanding what was going on and the big hit to the economy. And we asked people, we asked skilled trades pros in home services, are you experiencing serious layoffs, furloughs, or salary cuts? Are you experiencing minor layoffs, furloughs, or salary cuts? And both were around 20%. Whereas no changes or no changes yet, so there could be some, we're over half of people at the height of it. And if you compare that to what was going on in other parts of the economy, very, very different. We even saw about 10% of people saying they were increasing staff pay at the height of the lockdowns. And so if you roll all these things together, you end up with the hinting at the story that home services was about to behave very, very differently than other parts of the economy. So what happened with what people were experiencing at the onset of COVID-19? We also asked pros, are you seeing homeowner resistance to what's going on? And about 25% were saying we're seeing strong homeowner resistance to inside the home projects. About 40% of people were saying, well, we see some resistance, but it's not overwhelming. So as long as we're taking precautions, we can sort of address these things. But even at the height, about 20% of people are saying we're not seeing any homeowner resistance to inside the home projects. So this was our early indication that even at the height of everything, what people were experiencing on the ground in home services was distinct from what people were experiencing in other parts of the economy. Let's flip over to what consumers were experiencing. So a little bit later, this was in midsummer, we went out and we asked people who were doing home projects, and then also just the general population, how did COVID-19 specifically impact your time spent at home? Like 2% of people said less or significantly less time at home. About 10% of people said the same amount of time at home, but close to 90% of people said more, significantly more time at home. And this is across every single age, every single demographic. So it did dramatically change. And we knew that this was happening, right? It was a common experience for a lot of people. However, this is sort of putting an empirical number on it. And it was dramatically different in terms of the amount of time people were spending at home. And what did that mean? Because if you're suddenly at home, the nature of your home has changed for you. So we looked at, as a result of COVID-19, not just generally, but as a result of COVID-19 specifically, how has it changed your home needs? 70% of people said I have more home cooking needs as a result of COVID-19. 50% said more working from home. 40% said more home entertaining. Also around 40% more working out at the home gym. Personally, this was something that I leapt at the opportunity to do as soon as COVID hit. I went about to sort of find a way to fit a small home gym into our space. Uh, More outdoor living, about 30%, dedicated homeschooling space and dedicated childcare space were the lowest at about 20% more needs. But again, that's because a significant amount of the population doesn't have kids. So you can sort of exclude them. But so among the people who have school age kids, it's obviously a much higher percentage. But these are the percentages for the general population. So we saw a dramatic change in what people need out of their homes. And there's a bunch of reasons for this that are pretty intuitive. And I suspect some of you have already seen this or started to put it together. The first is if you're at home more, there's going to be more wear and tear just because you're using it more. And so we saw more maintenance needs around things like HVAC and plumbing and those sorts of things that are susceptible to ongoing stress of those systems as they're being used more. But also, if you're spending more time at home, you're going to be more cognizant and aware of the imperfections in your house because you're there more. And so that little thing that might annoy you when you come home at 7 o'clock at night and then have dinner and then stop thinking about it, now you're there all day staring at it. And so there's that piece. But also, you're no longer going to the gym or restaurants. So now you've got a brand new need. And across all those things, the value proposition is suddenly changed, because if you have a new need for your home, but you're only at your home a couple hours a day during the week, then the utility you get out of that, so the benefit, the good feeling that you have to pay a home service professional to give you, might not be worth it. You might say, well, yeah, I mean, I'd love to have a nicer kitchen, but I'm not going to spend 30,000 bucks on one because, how often would I use it? But now all of a sudden, nothing else has changed except you're suddenly there more. And so that added time that you're going to get to use that thing might make that $30,000 a lot more of an attractive expenditure in terms of improving your home. So we saw all these things on the consumer side. And what all these things led to, of course, is we asked people specifically, have you shifted money from any of these things into home services as a result of COVID-19? So not did you spend money on these things or did you spend less money here, but did you specifically in your mind take money that you were going to spend on thing A and instead spend it on your home? And in this case, we said, did you take money that you were going to spend on commuting and spend it on your home? And over 30% of households said yes. We said, did you cancel a vacation or reduce your vacation spending and spend it on your home? About 50% of people said yes. And then we asked, did you spend restaurant or eating out money, bars, restaurants, what have you? Have you taken some of that budget and as a result of COVID-19 spend it on your home? And it was 55% of people said yes. So across the board, we saw consumers reprogramming their discretionary budgets into spending on their homes. Putting all these things together, we put this little chart together that sort of shows the flow of how people were reprogramming their household budgets. So you can see that top row working out from home and home cooking, and then down at the bottom, that sort of feeds into the restaurant budget shifted. The vacation budget shifted from more home entertaining and more outdoor living. So you can see all of these things feeding together. And this is what consumers were doing. And in totality, across the sort of macro economy, these are the year-over-year average spending changes for consumers at all retail outlets versus home improvement retail outlets. And you can see dramatic differences in terms of what consumers did, almost mirror images of each other. So this is what happened as a result of COVID-19. We saw this big reprogramming. So think about part one, when we were looking at the market and all the houses and the structural issues we had around demographics and underbuilding the supply following the Great Recession. Then you look at COVID and it just threw all this additional expenditure at the home service market. Now let's look at actually understanding the consumer, because we want to know why people were doing this. We know what they did, but let's look at why they're doing it. So what are some brief highlights of what we can get from the consumer in 2021? And again, these are brief highlights. You can go to homeadvisor.com/research, and we constantly update and put out new material there. So you can sign up for emails and get additional insights. So this is just sort of a highlights of a couple of things about the consumer that I think fit into this story about what's happening to the market. Spending by generation. This is the first one. The overall projects, which are captured in orange, that doesn't change particularly dramatically by generation. You can see that the silent generation does about 2 projects on average, whereas Millennials and Gen Z top out at just shy of 4. So they do about twice as many projects on average, but that's not a huge range. Where if you look at spending, where Silent is spending about 4,000 and Millennials are spending close to 10, and this is on improvement projects specifically, then you've got a factor of about 2.5. So they spend significantly more than they do projects. And the takeaways here are that Silent are much more price sensitive than the others. And this makes a lot of sense because you're on a fixed income, you might be more likely to move or to be downsizing, which makes the investment less worthwhile. Whereas for younger cohorts, this is peak home buying, this is peak family formation, this is hitting your stride professionally, where suddenly you're no longer necessarily struggling to make ends meet, so you've got more discretionary income to put into your homes, and this gives you an idea of how much people are willing to sort of spend and do on projects. One sort of quick note on Gen Z is because this is such a young cohort, the people who are in Gen Z that own homes and are doing projects are probably not perfectly proportional with the rest of that age cohort because they'd be on the leading end of economic security. They're probably the highest earners because the oldest Gen Z are in their early 20s. And so we'll have to let a little bit more time run on the clock to see how, as a full cohort, they tend to spend and prioritize their homes. But overall, it is important to note that millennials grew up with, in particular, grew up with a highly visual way of communicating, right? Everybody has Instagram or Facebook was already pretty standard. And so people are used to sort of sharing things visually. And that's going to impact how you want to live. People also grew up with sort of cooking as a form of theater, right? Now that media is everywhere, whereas boomers growing up, it wasn't as pronounced. There were obviously a few cultural icons that made their mark on how people live and cook and enjoy their houses, but it wasn't as saturated as it is for younger generations, where visual aesthetics and design and cooking as theater and all these sorts of things are going to impact how people want to live in their homes. So take that away in terms of thinking about how the generations differ. The next thing is to think about how this might manifest in specific project types. One example would be looking at flooring, which is relatively age agnostic, versus home offices, which is very age sensitive. So when we look at flooring, you can see it drops down a little bit in terms of popularity by over the last year in terms of who's doing what. You can see Gen Z, among people who are doing projects within Gen Z, it was a little shy of 30% that were doing flooring. And that dropped down to a little shy of 20% among the silent, but it's pretty even in terms of preferences across all generations. Whereas if you look at adding a home office over the last year, virtually nobody in the silent generation did it. Not many boomers did. And in fact, like more than 3 times as many, almost 4 times as many millennials as boomers were putting in home offices. So you do get some differences by generation, and some aren't. And so depending on what sort of business you're in, you can start to think about, okay, well, if you're in flooring, think about silent as probably being more price sensitive. If you're in a design space, understand that your target for installing home offices or to give people really beautiful spaces at home to live in, beautiful and functional, then this is giving you a sense of who you should be targeting as your most likely client on that front. This has all been improvement. We'll do a quick sort of note on maintenance projects and also think about income. If we look at maintenance projects by income, you can see most households sort of do around 6 maintenance projects per year until you increase the income scale to households earning more than 125,000 a year. Then that jumps up pretty dramatically from about 6 to almost to a little over 10. So a pretty significant jump in terms of average projects undertaken. And our suspicion here is that under 75,000 people are still doing that because there's a cost savings and sort of a protective value of your asset component in maintenance projects. And that's true across most parts of the income spectrum until you get to the highest levels of the income spectrum. When you get there, then you run into people saying, I value my time too much and I can afford it, so I'm going to hire more people to do more maintenance projects. And I suspect this audience is mostly design and improvement. However, in the event that you do work in maintenance type projects, then this is obviously a little bit relevant in terms of what area you're working in. I want to close out the quick sort of insight into what consumers are thinking with the primary reason for home improvement. And in past years, we've seen financial return on investment be a really strong reason for why people are wanting to do home improvement projects because, hey, I just got this asset. I want to earn a return on it. I don't want to do anything that doesn't increase the value or where I don't get good value for my dollar. And that's what my house is. It's an asset. This year, overwhelmingly, the number one people who I did it, people were pursuing home improvement projects as their primary reason was to make their home better suit their lifestyle needs. So almost 40% of households, that was the primary reason. And then close, as sort of a closely related subject, get more personal enjoyment out of my updated home was a little over 25%. So well over half of households were those two reasons. You can see return on financial investment down there around 10% this year. And that is pretty profound in terms of how people are viewing their homes. So if we think about all this extra time at home, all the uncertainty that came with COVID, all these new needs where people were no longer going out and getting these things from other sectors of the economy in terms of entertaining and living and working out, and doing school and cooking and all these sorts of things, all of a sudden consumers are viewing their homes a little bit differently. And I think that's a really important and profound shift for people to internalize. So that's sort of the individual consumer view. What about what's going on in the macro economy? And as I said, the macro economy is easy to lose track of. You might pay attention to what the job numbers are every year, or you might pay attention to what the unemployment rate is, or things like that. But it's easy to gloss over those things because the connection isn't clear. So I want to highlight 4 different ways that the connection is pretty concrete between what you might experience on your day-to-day and what's going on in the broader sector. And we're going to do that by focusing on 4 things. The first is the supply shortages in available homes, which I alluded to earlier. The second is the interest rate effect on home prices, which is what we've seen just happen. And I'm sure a lot of people are paying attention to that. The third follows from that, and that's the home equity effect on home prices, or the home equity effect that comes out of home prices on overall remodeling and improvement spending. And then the fourth is what's going on with a lag in construction and what that could also bode. So the first is the supply shortages in available homes. What this is showing you is new homes completed going back about 40 or 50 years. And you can see the economic cycles are very pronounced in here where they go up and down. But if you look at the average level, it's around 1.5 million new homes per year is the rough completion rate. And it varies a little bit by cycle, but that's the rough period. And just before the housing bust in 2007, you can see it peaked at about 2.3 million new homes completed per year. And for the last decade, we've been dramatically lower, right? It bottomed out following the Great Recession. A couple of years after the recession had sort of ended, it bottomed out at about 500,000 new homes completed per year. So the rate of new home completion dropped by 70+%, dramatic decrease in terms of homes completed. And this is important because A, if you want to have people moving and upgrading homes and places to buy that are affordable, you need to produce more of them. B, it's also important because so much of the talent that comes into the improvement and remodeling and maintenance spaces come out of the home building space. Home builders recruit a lot of people into their industry. And both of those things were not happening for the last 10 or so years at the rate that they had been happening prior. And this is sort of also getting at why, if you think back to one of those first charts, why we saw the total occupied housing grow at a much faster rate than total housing. And that's because we've been underbuilding total housing. And this is where we were coming into COVID, when we suddenly had all this dramatic shifting refocused into what's going on in the remodeling market. Let's look at the second effect, the interest rate effect on prices. So the top chart, you can see the 30-year mortgage rate change since the start of this most recent COVID-induced recession. And the mortgage rate has dropped pretty dramatically. It's dropped by over 20% at this point on average, if not more. And they were already dropping before this recession hit. So they've gone down pretty dramatically, where close to 2 years ago, rates were 4.5% for a 30-year. Now they're down to, I think I saw this morning, like 2.6%. So these are what's going on nationally in the housing markets. In terms of the housing effect on prices, something economists love to highlight is that there's no free lunch. The system is complex, it's dynamic, everything feeds into itself. And as a result, if consumers suddenly have all this extra effective buying power because the money that they're getting is cheaper, if your interest rate drops, then your money, the price of getting a big loan from the bank is getting cheaper, they're going to bid up prices, all else equal, unless there's an infinite supply of houses, which of course there isn't, because A, that would be impossible in the best case scenario, and we're not even anywhere close to the best case scenario because we've been underbuilding houses for a decade. As a result, you can see the Case-Shiller 20 largest city index, the 10 city largest index, and the national index have all seen big increases in their average home prices since the onset of this COVID recession. And this is not because the mix of housing changes. The neat thing about the Case-Shiller indices is that they control for the quality of housing. So this is saying an identical house, how is its price changing? So we've seen, and what we're seeing there is because this is basically trying to capture an identical house and how its price increases over time, this is showing us that consumers are bidding that up. That leads to this next effect, which is the equity effect. So we've seen prices go up, and that's relevant because for remodeling, because if prices are going up, then new buyers aren't going to be buying a house of equal quality as what they would have got before. Instead, they might be pushed a little bit lower down the quality chain, so something a little bit older. The average age of a house is about 40 years in the United States on average. And if consumers are moving into older homes, there's more work to be done there. So that's why it's relevant for the remodeling market. The next piece of why it's relevant is the equity effect. So what we've just seen was what prices are doing for people who are buying houses. But of course, most people aren't buying houses. Most people are already in their houses and they're not in the market to buy or sell. Even though we've got very high rates of people who are buying houses, most of the population is staying put. But they are seeing the value of their house rise. And you can see that the number of new single family homes sold has gone up, the 30-year mortgage has gone down. This is just sort of visualizing what we were just looking at. And the home equity effect is capturing all of the people who are in their homes, and now their homes are rising in effective value. And that can also fuel more sort of tailwind effect for the remodeling market because people just got new money that they weren't expecting because their home value increased. Their mortgage probably got a lot cheaper. As mortgage rates drop, a lot of people refinance. This has been a record year for refinancing. So now people have more money on a month-to-month basis because their interest rate went down. People who are already in their homes pre-COVID didn't have to pay more for them, but now that mortgage is cheaper than what they were expecting, and they've seen the value in their homes go up. So this is all potential tailwind for the remodeling market. And then the final thing, so this is just sort of re-summarizing that, and the final thing in terms of the macroeconomy is the lag in new home construction. It's easy to look at economic series and just sort of assume, okay, these are just numbers that move. But of course, they're capturing real day-to-day activity. And if we look at what happened to new homes that were being started and completed, everything dropped in April and May, particularly of this year. It looked like a deep V in terms of what's happened to those series, because everybody just stopped doing everything for 2 months or so. The big jump back up to completing homes, sort of, a lot of that was made up over the summer. But to start a new home is not an instant process. Neither is it to build it. And so because that process was turned off for a few months, we can expect to see a lag in terms of completions following that. And what this chart is showing is the lag between new home construction and completion of new homes in terms of if you just sort of follow the averages. And you can see it peaks at about 8-9 months in terms of the lag that you get with, if you see a big increase in new home starts, 8-9 months later, you can expect to see a big increase in new home completions. We saw a big drop in new home starts this past spring. And so as we come into this coming spring, we can expect to see that lag sort of manifest itself. So even though people have been starting new homes all summer at a higher rate, there's no magical way to make up for that lost time. So there'll be a little bit of a shortage relative to what could have been coming into this 2021 home buying season. And again, this is also going to fuel this issue of higher prices. So interest rates plus the lag in new home construction plus the underbuilding for years are all going to be fueling this shortage. So let's think about a couple sort of questions as we take stock before we get into strategies to adapt. So first are we front loading demand? This is a really important question for anybody who remembers the Great Recession a little over 10 years ago. The automobile sales fell off a cliff, and there were all of these efforts made to get people buying cars again, and those things worked, but it just pulled the demand forward. And so after those programs expired, it was just an even worse period for car sales. Have we done that with housing? Personally, I don't think so. I think when you take all these things together, I don't think that 2020 has front loaded all the housing home service demand for the next couple of years. I think that demand will remain pretty healthy. Is there a permanent shift to the suburbs? That's a harder question. Even if it's not out to the suburbs, as we saw from home spending, even if people are just getting a little bit more space and moving into townhouses, the spending still rises dramatically relative to apartments in high rises. So even if it doesn't have to be a full shift to the suburbs to see any sort of dramatic increase in home service spending. We could still see big increases if people are just moving a little bit outside of city centers into townhouses. How will we live and move? That's a great question. Nobody knows. However, we do know that consumers have started to rethink how they approach their housing and the value they get out of it. So when you're marketing yourself to people or talking to people about the value you bring, really think through answering this question for them in terms of, your home is a deeply intimate personal space, and you don't want something that is that doesn't really satisfy you in terms of hitting those key lifestyle needs. How do you adapt to all these things? So let's get into some strategies to adapt and what you should be doing. So the first sort of strategy is that when you're thinking through what consumers need, really think through how you're marketing yourself to this lifestyle piece and recognize that the value that people get out of it is going to shift. If you've got older clients, all else equal, they are going to be a little bit more price sensitive than the younger ones. Obviously, if older clients are significantly wealthier than younger ones, you'll have to adjust for that. But if you sort of control for wealth and other characteristics, then you're going to see the youngers are going to be a little bit less price sensitive. But I think that the single biggest thing to think about is how do you grow your business? How do you grow your team? Because there's all this demand. And if you really want to take advantage of it, you should be thinking about how to grow, because right now there is a shortage. And so the key strategies that I want to focus on are how you can bring more people into your company, how we can bring more people into the industry and grow to meet that. Because, if you're working by yourself or you've got a small company, you can get a few more clients, but obviously if you can get a lot more and have the internal staff to handle that, that's your best case scenario. And housing doesn't behave, I think, like other things. That's sort of also getting back to this front loading of demand question. The front loading of demand is relevant for a car, because once somebody buys a car, they've bought a car. They're not in the market for another one for at least a couple of years typically. Whereas with housing, I don't think as a good in the mind of the consumer, it behaves the same way. If you go and remodel one room of your house, I don't think that makes you less likely to remodel another room. I actually think it makes you more likely to remodel another room because you've gone through the process of seeing how much that new space makes you happy. And it also makes you think, okay, well, now I want the whole house to match. I don't want one really nice modern bathroom. I kind of want them all to be nice. And so we've got all this demand coming down the pipeline, and we've got a shortage of people in the industry. So the first thing I want to focus on in terms of the industry shortage is something that I find very, very striking. And that's this chart that shows the number of people who are very satisfied or somewhat satisfied in their career choice in the skilled trades. If you add those two together, you get 82%. That is remarkably high if you look at what other industries have in terms of job satisfaction. And there's a really, I think, romantic story here to tell about how fulfilling it is to work in such a fun industry. Homes are something we all have. It's one of those two core human needs, food and shelter. And doing that work with your hands or with your mind, if you're a designer, and getting sort of, really artistic in how you approach things, all of these things are very, very satisfying. And the reason we know that is that we didn't just stop here when we were asking skilled tradespeople about how happy they were. We looked specifically at the reasons for job satisfaction. And for people who are neutral in their career choice, you can see it's pretty evenly split between the primary reason being overall compensation, dealing with clients and customers, flexibility with work hours, and meaning and value of work. They're all pretty evenly split. But if you look over on the very satisfied, you can see meaning and value of the work is the number one reason by a mile. Right? 35% of people who are very satisfied, the number one reason is meaning and value in the work. The next closest, which is much lower when you compare it to all those others, is flexibility with work hours. Then one after that is dealing with clients and customers. And then the final one, the lowest reason, is overall compensation. So even though the compensation in home services can be great and higher than many other parts of the economy, for people who are really satisfied, it's the lowest reason why. And so that is something that when you're going out and recruiting people and trying to grow your business, you should really be focusing on. This isn't just about doing something with your hands or doing something artistic. It's also about being really, really happy with what you choose to do. And the reason why I'm focusing on these things as a key strategy is that there's overwhelming agreement among people across the trades that there is a pronounced labor shortage. And as you've seen from this macro piece, from what's going on in housing, from the shift from COVID, there's all this demand, there's limited supply. The industry, even though it grew this year, could have grown a lot more. And this is bringing a lot of joy to people. But what are the consequences of this trade labor shortage? Turning down jobs is the number one reason. So a lot of people are just raising prices. We sort of view that as a baseline, but decreasing profits because you're going to have to pay more for your labor and turning down jobs, those are not things you want to see happening in an industry. You want to see increasing profits and getting more jobs. That's what we want to see. And that can have a pronounced effect on your day-to-day life in your business. And so if you really want to grow and take advantage of all of this demand and the shift to the home, your number one thing you should be thinking about is recruiting people, because the number one consequence is that people are turning down jobs. And that's a bad experience for consumers. It's a bad experience for pros because of decreasing profits. And it's a bad thing for the economy when so many parts of it are hurting. There is one bright spot, but it could be brighter because we just don't have enough people working in the industry. And the way we solve this is by individual businesses going out and recruiting more. And we've heard from a lot of people, hey, it's really hard to recruit. It's hard to find talented people. I don't doubt that there's some truth to that, but I think a lot of it is inertia and people sort of doing things the same way and not expecting anything other than the same results, which you don't want to do. What you should be doing is thinking, okay, how can I get outside of the box? And we specifically looked at, okay, well, demographically, how are the trades doing? And the design sector is doing pretty well in terms of gender parity. Among the skilled trades of going into homes and sort of doing individual bits of work like putting in electrical systems, flooring, drywall, etc., those all have about a 10% female work share. We all know the population split roughly 50-50. That is overwhelmingly disproportionate to what the population looks like. And so if you're hearing somebody complaining, well, there's a trade labor shortage in electrical, unless they're trying to recruit women, I'm not very sympathetic to it, because we dramatically under capture half of the population pulling people into these things. And a skeptic might say, well, maybe women aren't interested in these jobs. That's something a skeptic might say. Okay, fair enough. But we went out and we asked people, would making the trades more welcoming to women and providing a clear pathway make a big difference? And if you ask men, a significantly smaller proportion strongly agree with that statement than women. And so if you combine this with that last slide, thinking about what the share is, if you have an industry that's overwhelmingly male, and those men overwhelmingly don't think it would make a difference, but the women do, it's going to be much harder because there's far fewer people in there that are trying to make these pathways. So the pathways have to be established. People do agree, but there's just so much inertia, it's going to be a big lift. But think through, how are we recruiting more women into the industry? Because that's a big strategy that we need to consider to adapt to all this demand that is coming in. Uh, Same story, but with demographic representation. People across the demographic, every single demographic group in the United States, the satisfaction levels are still very, very high for people who are doing the skilled trades work across the spectrum. You can see here, right? Everybody's, there's a little bit of variance, but not dramatic. But if we look at, specifically the Black share of the workforce that is underrepresented, you can see among carpenters, it's 60% less than what the population would assume, right? Among roofers, plumbers, electricians, it's around 40%. Cement's doing okay, around just 10% lower. But same story here with demographics. We've got huge untapped labor pools, and we just need to break the inertia where we're not recruiting people in and establish clear pathways to pull more people in so that we can grow the industry and make more consumers happy with the provisions of goods and services. And then the last two things I want to do is highlight recruitment. And this is sort of, I think, particularly relevant to pulling younger people in. 62% of people are still using word of mouth recommendations as their primary method of recruitment. And that's not who you're going to pull in, unless you're a YouTube gaming streamer or something like that. You're probably not interacting with many young people by word of mouth recommendations. You probably have to break the mold a little bit. Only a quarter of people are doing online job postings. That's not nearly enough. Classified ads in newspapers, Craigslist, they're all even lower. Recruiting from high schools is lower still. So if you combine all of those things, you end up with a story of an industry that is not doing enough to expand its reach and to pull in people from as many different fields as possible or different backgrounds. And particularly when you think about word of mouth, you're only going to sort of pull in people that you have a social relationship with. And so if the industry is predominantly underrepresenting certain groups and people sort of socialize that way, you just get this natural inertia where we're not pulling people in from different areas. And so that's another big thing, is really think through recruitment, right? Even if you weren't planning on growing your business, consider it, because that is, I think, the number one strategy, is grow your business and make a concerted effort to develop your pipeline. And then the final thing I'll sort of close with on this is recruitment incentives. People are offering above average wages. That's great, 32%. Health insurance, 7.8% is sort of a highlighted advantage that people are looking at. But if you look at a lot of these things, I mean, only 16% of people are offering career advancement. And if as an elder millennial, I can tell you what millennials like is career advancement and a sense of ownership and meaning and value in work. You don't even see meaning and value in the work on this list. People aren't even thinking about it. So even though people are really satisfied, love the meaning and value of the work, it's not a highlighted recruitment incentive that people are really out there pursuing. So when you add all these things in together, the industry just has so much more work to do. And by the industry, I mean, think about your individual business. How active are you in this recruitment front? And there is so many things we could highlight, and we're just not doing it, but it's right there on the table. So I don't think it's a big, hard lift. I think it's a pretty easy lift if we just sort of think through it and approach it with some intentionality. So wrapping all this up, we covered what the market looks like coming into 2020, about 125 million occupied houses that we're servicing, doing about 511 million jobs per year, $1,000 a job, about 5 million people doing the work. 2020 shifted a whole bunch of fundamentals. People are suddenly doing their homes with a lot more intentionality about what it is. It's not just an asset anymore. It's now this place that is deeply intimate where we live. Consumers, of course, have a range of variances and price sensitivities, but overwhelmingly, they're spending more time at home and having more needs out of it. A whole bunch of macro changes are colliding together. We've been underbuilding houses for a decade. Interest rates are lower, which is bidding up prices, which shifts the whole vacancy chain. People are going to be in older houses. People who are already in houses are suddenly flush with more equity. And all of these things are just serving as a nice, strong, coordinated tailwind for the remodeling industry and demand for home services. And then with all these things going on, we don't have enough people working in the industry. So while there's a number of strategies around thinking about how you approach different parts of the consumer spectrum, I think the number one thing you should focus on is how do you grow your business? And in order to do that, we have to be really intentional about building out that supply chain, recruiting more people into the industry, making sure that we are tapping every part of the country for talent and growing that labor pool, and highlighting that this is a very, very satisfying and rewarding field to work in. And that's a story that we just need to tell a little bit more. So on that note, I think Debbie, if we've got time for Q&A, we can run through things. I've cleared my schedule, so happy to chat with folks and discuss questions. I see that the chat box has been pretty active, so I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, Misha, this has been so very thought provoking. Thank you so very much. A lot of great information that you shared, and I know we have some market research folks in that are on our staff, and a woman that's working with our next up with the trade. So I'm definitely going to share this uh, recording with them. So thank you so much. And yes, we do have questions. And just before we get started, I wanted to thank Gebert for their generous sponsorship for all of our webinars and today's session as well. And to thank you, Misha. And I know Sherry's in the audience. Hi to Sherry. Thank you for being with us. And so Tim is asking, so these are in chronological order. So back in the beginning, you were talking about high-rise condos, and Tim wants to know, are high-rise condos included with apartment, high-rise, or is a condo considered a single family?
It would be included in the high rise. So single family would be the structure has 4 distinct walls, not shared with anybody. Probably has a yard, and that's why you see the spending so much higher.
Oh, that's interesting. It probably has a yard. Okay.
So sorry, among the single family, the high rise condo or apartment, it's there. That's the whole average. Obviously, if you look at people who own a condo, they're going to spend a little bit more than somebody who rents it. But if somebody's renting it, the owner of it will be doing that expenditure for them. So it's sort of a wash. The structure itself on a unit basis just has a little bit less spending on average in terms of remodeling and how they view it. And that's because, if you think about a high rise, the big expenditures are going to be the elevator, which people don't really sort of consider part of the improvement process. Elevators are expensive. If they have if it's a 30-floor building and there's a pool on the 15th floor, that's going to be expensive, but that's not factored into the individual unit's core function. Whereas a house with a pool, that is factored in, or a house has a big roof, whereas a condo unit has no roof. There's just one roof for the whole structure. So that's why you see a threefold increase in spending on a per unit basis when people shift from a small condo to a standalone single family house in the burbs.
Okay, thank you. Angela, excuse me. On the mortgage interest rate chart, she said it's the one with the Case-Shiller, the 20 city chart. Can you help me read those 3 bottom charts better? She said you mentioned a significant increase, but the chart reads 24% increase. And she said, I'm not sure if I'm reading it correctly or what the index really means.
Sure. So this is the chart. It is, and I encourage everybody to go to the S&P website too. They put this out every month. I also occasionally will talk about these things on Twitter, and hit me up there anytime. I try to be more active on Twitter. I've ignored it for years, but I'm trying to be a little bit better about it. But this is showing the 1 month increase. So increased 0.24% over the last month when this was pulled up in August. This is showing the 12-month trend. And so you can see right here is when COVID hit. And so the 12-month trend is a big uptick across the national, the 10 city, and the 20 city. The number here is just showing the individual 1 month change. And that doesn't look necessarily super high, but remember this compounds. So 0.56 1 month and then 0.56 the next month. That second 0.56 is compounding the first 0.56, which is why you end up with, just like with compounding savings in your bank account or your stock portfolio or any of those things, you get the same compounding savings or same compounding growth with your house. So if your house is growing 10% every year, you're compounding that 10%. And so the same effect happens on a monthly basis. So that's why something that might not look really big on a month-to-month basis actually fuels quite a lot when you stack it up over the year.
Okay, thanks for that explanation. That helped a lot. I think people are just taking in everything that you said, and I don't have any other questions here, but feel free to talk a little bit more if you want to, or we can close. It is entirely up to you. If there's anything else that you'd like to share with the group before we go.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, if anybody else wants to chime in here, I'm just sort of browsing through it. Like I said, I'm reach out anytime if another question pops out into your mind later. I'm more active on LinkedIn than I am on Twitter, but I'm trying to change that with Twitter. So I'm always happy to chat with people and answer questions and all that sort of stuff. And I also I toy around on the weekends as I like to make my own furniture and to try and do my own design work. I figure if somebody is trying to understand a market, they shouldn't just be, you know, a dweeb with a pair of glasses sitting behind a computer. They should actually be out there doing it. So I I also love engaging with people on the actual craftsmanship. So I recently built a solid slab walnut dining table and put in an accent wall in the bedroom with a, you know, it's trendy, so put in a shiplap accent wall in the bedroom that my wife wanted. So I always enjoy talking about design stuff too. So if there's any design professionals, I always love getting unsolicited tips and advice.
They're a very talented man, it sounds like. So actually, two more questions should come in. So let's go with those. So Aviva says, do you see an increase in new housing that might be coming up?
Yes, there will be an increase in new housing. We'll eventually get there. If you look at home builder sentiment, it's off the charts. They're getting into this, but they're running into two issues. The first is land, and the second is rising prices. So if you think about it, I guess the third is that it's not instantaneous to buy a house. And so if you are in the process of home building, do you want to sell a whole bunch of houses? Like if you're a large home builder, for a smaller boutique firm, this is a little less relevant, but for a larger home builder who build a lot of the supply, do you want to sell all of next year's houses right now, or do you want to hold off a little bit because you can sell them for a higher price next year? And so that's naturally spacing out the boom to new home building. The other thing is that there's only so much land, and counties have to permit it. Counties have been shut down due to COVID, and they've got a backlog. And so there's this boom coming, but as much as we've seen a lot happen this year, it hasn't all manifested in terms of actually seeing the new houses. But even as these new houses come in, it's still short of what the demand is. And so we're still going to see, I think, a lot of people pushed out of the new home price range because of all this, the demand, even though we increase supply, the demand is increasing at a higher rate. So prices are going up, and that's going to push people who otherwise might have bought a new home into an older fixer upper. And so that's why I think it serves as a tailwind.
That's great. So Anna is here in our audience, and she says, I own and operate a woman-led construction company and would love to expand the women that work for me. What do you think would make this line of work more interesting for this underrepresented group?
I mean, that's a really, really great question. There's a few things that I think, but I actually would love to hear further thoughts from Anna about what made her pursue owning and operating this company, because those answers are probably, I mean, I'd love to hear them because I think that would be part of the story. My initial inclination is that we have to start earlier in terms of how we highlight this to people, and we have to look more broadly in terms of how we get people interested in it. And there are, you know, like if you look at YouTube is a great source, or any sort of online platform, you know, any sort of blogging platform, and there are a number of women tradespeople that I follow on there. Because they're doing great work and they make great content. And I think that natural organic thing of just, you know, for a young girl to see a woman doing this sort of work is going to make them aware, like, oh, this is something I can pursue, and it pays really well and it's really satisfying work. So I think the first is we just have to do more talking about it. We just have to highlight, hey, people like you are doing this work and really liking it. And I think that's a big part of the story. And it's why these changes are hard, because you don't have many people doing it. So how do you show people? So there's just this natural inertia that you just have to break by being really loud and really highlighting it. Beyond that, I think there are things that the industry can do that would be good, not just for recruiting more women, but would be good for recruiting more people in general. The first is, I think, culturally, and I think this is changing, but if you talk to people who went to the trades in the 70s and 80s, culturally, you know, there was, I think, more of and I'm speaking in broad generalities here, but I think there was more of a hazing culture. There was more of a culture around, you know, making it tough on the new guy, and all these sorts of things that I don't think are constructive to building a broad group of people who are entering something. And so I think formalizing a more supportive environment that encourages people to come in and be their best self and take ownership without some of the hazing that we had in prior generations, I think that would be a good thing. You know, my father just retired as a tradesman, and he spent, you know, close to 50 years working as a tradesman. And, you know, hearing his stories about how things changed in terms of their training. And he specifically did electrical line work for the power company. So it's not home services, but I think the same principle applies, which is that when he came in, he was trained by, you know, a bunch of cowboys that were that no sense of safety standards, no sense of like of progression. It was just do the work, don't die, if you can avoid it. Whereas when he's changing the next generation coming up, what he's found really effective was people are willing to work really hard, just as hard if not harder than his generation or the generation that trained him. But what they do want is they want an environment that's not toxic, and they want a clear sort of progression path with ownership. And so I think that is a universal story. But I don't know if Anna's had a chance to chime in on.
Yeah, she said
Yeah,
that she wants to connect with you, so I think she's going to at some point and
perfect.
continue the conversation. So
Great. Yeah, I'd love to
in
hear
the
that.
meantime, yeah, thank you. In the meantime, people are saying, that we need to encourage our daughters. We need to make vocational schools more applicable to girls. So those are good comments. I do have two more questions, Misha, if you don't
Mhm.
mind.
Of course.
So Michael wants to know, does this mean the millennials will be looking to remodel homes being available from the boomers?
Yes. So right now, boomers own the majority of houses, but millennials are the number one buyer of houses. And there's this big shift that's starting because of the demographics, right? Obviously, in 40 years, millennials are going to be the same age as boomers, and boomers are not going to be alive anymore. So you've got this very intense effect there. But if you shrink that down and look at it on a shorter time frame, you're going to see this asset transfer. And the average house is 40 years old, and a millennial who's hitting 30, and there's all this new technology around home efficiency. There's different design trends are constantly changing, as all the designers and builders on here know. And that vacancy chain that starts when somebody sells a house and then the next person sells the house, that's what you want in the industry. And all those homes are going to shift. And even the ones that don't shift, there's a pretty dramatic difference in terms of home needs. Somebody from 20 through mid late 60s, early 70s, the type of house that they can live in is pretty similar. But once you start hitting 70s, 80s, 90s, or hundreds, because we see plenty of people living past 100 now, then that's when you actually have to sort of see a dramatic reshape in how a house is. Like I said, I've got one grandfather who's 98, 99 now, and he could never live in the house that I live now because it's got all these stairs in it, and that is something that has to change. And so same thing with sinks. If people are more likely to need wheelchairs, lots of accessibilities around sort of your wrists and joints, maybe safety things in case there's a fall. So all of these things have to be added to a house if people stay. And if they don't stay, it still needs to be renovated as well. So it's a long-winded way of saying yes.
That's a great answer, though. You gave a lot of great insight into that answer. And then a final question here, so we can wrap. So Angela's wanting to know, do you see that the demand for in-person brick and mortar showrooms is increasing, or is the majority of the demand for home service and products shifting to internet purchasing?
It's a really good question. I've seen a mixed bag personally. I think if you look at how the big box home improvement retailers, your Home Depots, Lowe's, Aces, et cetera, have done, they have done significantly better than the rest of retail with the rise of Amazon and other forms of digital shopping. So I think that the nature of this stuff is different. Because it's typically a high purchase item, right? If you're like I recently got a new pair of headphones, right? Here they are. Well, I think they're there. So I bought those off Amazon because I don't, I can read the reviews and it's not a big purchase, right? It's like $60. So it's not this big, massive purchase. If you're spending $30,000 on a kitchen reno, that's fundamentally different. You're not necessarily going to get a better supply chain performance, right? But Amazon has sort of optimized where they can ship these out in 2 hours in a lot of metros. So that actually, it's faster than going to the store and picking something out. That's not the case for buying a big slab of granite or being, if you're short a couple of things and popping out. So I think the in-person showrooms will remain pretty healthy because people on these big ticket purchases want to go in and browse, because you're putting in a new countertop that's going to be there for 20 years. You don't want to, or longer. You don't want to go off of an online picture. You want to actually see it in person. So I think that's one of the reasons why the evidence we've seen so far. I think we will see, for things like dimensional lumber. Maybe people are buying a little bit more of it, but again, that's different than a showroom. And even on that sort of thing, I mean, I do a lot of home projects. I don't like buying lumber remotely because I know that the person at the lumberyard is not going to select the least warped products. I want to go in and select the wood myself. I recently put up some cedar outdoor stuff, and I didn't buy any of it remotely. I wanted to go in and pick it out in the lumberyard because I knew that the person pulling it out might say, "Oh, he's buying remotely. We'll just give him this one that's twisted or warped." And so buying in person is still pretty powerful, I think, for a lot of this stuff.
Yeah. And since you've been talking, we've had more questions come in. Do you mind?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. That's a great answer, by the way. It sounds like it's a 50-50 mix. Um, so Tiffany wants to know any thoughts on what this means for real estate sales in 2021. She said we get customers upgrading and asking us to look into our crystal ball for answers.
Yeah, sorry, let me pull that up. Can you repeat the question one more time?
Yes, of course. Any thoughts? This is in the Q&A, so you may
Oh,
not be
okay.
able to
Yeah,
see it.
okay. Yeah.
Any thoughts on what this means for real estate sales in 2021?
I think they'll remain pretty strong. Real estate sales we'll probably see more people listing potentially. This year, there haven't been that many people listing. That's one of the reasons why there's been this imbalance is lots of people want to buy because the money's cheap, but not many people have been listing. A lot of refinancing, but not a lot of listing. So I think next year will also be a pretty healthy year for real estate. Whether or not the total originated mortgage volume is higher or lower, good question. But I don't think it's going to drop off. I think we'll see a pretty healthy rate, and because I think that the Federal Reserve overall rate obviously doesn't perfectly lead the mortgage rate. That sort of follows from the bond market, but it certainly trends together. And I think that the big top line interest rates, the Fed will probably keep them low for a year. So,
Okay.
so my guess is next year will be pretty good.
Okay. And then, so someone wants to know, does this apply? You've talked a lot about US. Does this apply to the housing and work market in Canada?
Yes, to a lesser extent. Canada, the mortgage market is different, and the I mean, it's like in the U.S. you can lock in a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. You can't do that in Canada. Right? You get a 5-year fixed, and then you're going to be variable. So the U.S. mortgage market is a really nice hedge against inflation. It's less so with Canada. Also, mortgage interest deductions, if I remember correctly, aren't exactly the same. So you have, and that incentive got a little bit smaller because of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act a couple of years ago, which increased the standard deduction and decreased the mortgage interest deduction. So as a result, it's a little bit less of an incentive for home ownership, but it's still more of an incentive than you typically get in Canada. And so I think it'll be true in Canada, but probably less pronounced. That's my guess. I don't pay as close attention to the Canadian market, but I am a dual U.S. Canadian citizen, so I pay attention to what Canadian friends are up to, but I don't follow it as closely professionally.
Okay. Carla'd like to know, she says, I read there are some cities which are going to not allow any more single home builds at some point. Can you speak to that a bit more and how that might impact building and living trends?
Yeah, and this feeds into I saw somebody else mention in the chat the NIMBY question.
Mm-hmm.
Housing in a lot of cities is high because people want it to be high, not because it has to be high. It's high because people haven't allowed more dense building. I think that story is changing for two reasons. One, remote work is going to make it a little bit easier at the margins for people not to have to live as close. I don't think that we're going to see permanent remote work. I think that a team in person is just going to outcompete a team that isn't in person. You also get professional effects, right? I mean, people enter companies, they like to rise the ranks. And if you're the one person not in the room, you're not going to feel like you're in the mix and getting the same degree of influence. And so that's going to encourage people back into the office. So there's all these little effects that I think will pull people back into the office. But we will see some shift from completely in person to more remote. And I think that will, at the margins, push people maybe on average an extra 10, 15, 20 minutes out of wherever the core is. So that's one alleviation to it, which is that it doesn't matter if one city, what its zoning rules is, people can go to the next city over and get higher density or get more land. Within cities, there has been a strong push. You've seen, I think, a growing political coalition around trying to change zoning laws and say, hey, this is on an intergenerational level deeply unfair, right? Like if you look at San Francisco, which is sort of one of the more extreme examples, you had all this housing stock owned by one generation, then you had a boom in jobs, and the next generation came in, And the older generation, which sort of controls the zoning process, has said, no, we're not allowing higher density. And that just massively bid up the price of the assets that are owned. So on an intergenerational level, it's not particularly fair. And local municipalities have a right to set their own zoning rules. But I think that people are starting to make the argument saying, hey, there's a lot of harm that are caused by these zoning rules because it's making things so unaffordable. And we have to do a better job of striking a balance between preserving the historic feel of a neighborhood versus making sure new people can move in and get higher houses. I think that you get a lot of benefits just by switching from single family just to 2-3 story townhouses, right? I mean, that's not a high rise, but you've now tripled your density or greater. The townhouse that I'm in, there's 8 townhouses on what used to be a single family house lot. So now you've had an 8x increase in the density of this area, and I'm right outside of Denver. So you've seen this big increase in the density, but you haven't seen a dramatic reshaping of the neighborhood feel. And so I think that will be pretty common. I think we'll see a lot of that.
Great. This has been so informative. It really has, Misha. And I want to thank you so much for your time. And we're a little over time, but I really appreciate that you stayed. And I want to thank all of you, and thank you, Gebrit, once again. And I hope everyone has a great holiday. Thanks again, Misha.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And I do see Sarah E. asked about shipping samples. Yes.
Go ahead.
Obviously, don't send them out willy-nilly because there's a cost to that. But yeah, they can be a really great tool. I routinely get them myself, and a lot of companies have added that in the last year and are making sure they do that. So they can be a really great thing. Just control your cost. Don't, if it costs you $100 to send out some samples, don't do that recklessly because that could get expensive.
I'm sure it can. Well, thanks again so very much, Misha. It's been a really great session today.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Take care.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.